Welcome back, everybody. So in this part 2 of lecture 2, we're going to be talking about tissues. And just start sharing my screen. What tissues are is they're going to be groups of cells working together. So they're going to be groups of cells working together for a common function. So they're working together for a common function. You can think of, say, your own skin cells. Yeah, there might be different kinds of cells there overall, but they're all together accomplishing the function of your skin. Same thing with, say, the cells lining the inside of your stomach. Now we're going to see when we look at plants that overall there's going to be 3 tissue types, right? These 3 tissue types are going to be the epidermis, the ground, and the vascular tissue system. And what we'll do is we'll go through each one and talk about what it looks like and see some real pictures too. So I'm going to start with the epidermis. And the reason I'm starting with the epidermis is, well, it's that outermost cell layer of plants. It's that outermost cell layer covering our plant organs. So it's forming the outside of our root stems and our leaves. And one thing that we're going to see about the epidermis, one thing that's going to distinguish it from either ground tissue or vascular tissue, is it's going to be the one tissue type that's what we call a simple tissue. And by simple, I mean that it's composed of just one cell type. And that one cell type is parenchyma. And so there's this epidermal layer, right, covering the outsides of our root stems and our leaves, and it's made up of parenchyma. And as it's forming the outside, as you might guess, it functions a little bit in protection, particularly against things like water loss. Because it's also the outside of the plant, it also is going to be responsible for exchange with the environment. With, I abbreviate just like that. So at this epidermal layer, where the plant is going to absorb water, right? It's where carbon dioxide is going to be lost. It's where minerals are going to be absorbed out of the soil. Now, we're going to be looking at the epidermis on the outside of leaves, and we're going to see some specialized cells in that epidermal layer that are what we call guard cells. And I'm just going to draw a couple of these guard cells. All right, so these 2 cells right here are guard cells. And as that name implies, these cells are guards, and what they're guarding is they're guarding this little hole in between them called the stoma. The word root of stoma means mouth, and this is just a hole, a pore for gas exchange. Now we're going to find these on the outside of the epidermis of leaves and stems. The guard cells are going to be responsible for actually opening and closing the stomata. Stomata is just the plural form of the word stoma. Stoma is one, stomata is many. And so these guard cells are going to open and close that stoma to prevent, say too much gas exchange from occurring. And what I mean by that is that one thing that is lost out of the stoma is carbon dioxide, which is fine. That's, a byproduct of photosynthesis, and so that's not a big deal. But sometimes plants can lose too much water vapor. And so when they're under water stress, they'll actually close their stomata to prevent too much water from being lost. So guard cells and stomata are some of these specialized cells we can find inside the epidermis. There's one other cell that we can see there before we look at some of these pictures. This other cell that we can find in the epidermis, it's kind of specialized, are what we call trichomes. And trichomes are hairs on the epidermis. And I know you've seen these. I know you've seen these because you walk around in the world. And they can function different ways. They function to deter herbivores, right? Things that might eat plants. They can also function in preventing sun damage. You can kind of think of them as like sunblock. And they can also function in regulating water loss. And what I mean by that is they can actually trap a layer of air next to the leaf that traps a more moist microclimate. Now let's look at some pictures of these. All right, here's an epidermis, and you can see most of these cells are these kind of lobed and interlocking cells. Those are just ordinary epidermal parenchyma. But then every so often you see these kind of coffee bean-like structures. Those are those guard cells flanking our stomata. We look at them another way. Here's one highly, highly magnified with an electron microscope. Here's that stoma, that hole, and here's those guard cells on either side. All right, and they'll open and close that stoma to help prevent too much water loss. All right, here's the macroscopic view of trichome. So see what I mean? You've seen these things before. You've seen them on really furry plants like this lamb's ear here, or this little fuzzy succulent here. We're going to see some trichomes under the microscope. We're not going to see them magnified this much because this is with an electron microscope, but sometimes they have these really cool shapes, and it's some of the different things that we can see when we look at plants and try and understand diversity. We can actually look at trichome diversity, which is really cool. All right, so trichomes, guard cells, and their stomata are all features that we can see within the epidermis. Let's meet another tissue. So the second tissue that we're going to talk about today is what we call ground tissue. And ground tissue is going to be a complex tissue. And when we talk about tissues and we call them complex, all we mean by that is that there's more than one cell type. In fact, it's typically in ground tissue where we can find all three cell types, where we can find parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. And so if we think about the plant body, that epidermis is that outermost layer. The ground tissue is just going to be one cell layer in. And as far as how it functions inside the plant, well, it's got several functions. It functions in storage. So materials can be stored inside ground tissue. It could function in support. And it can also kind of filter what enters or exits the vascular tissue. Now, vascular tissue, remember, is going to be that internal conductive tissue. And it's the conduit really to the rest of the plant. And so plants can somewhat limit what can get in or out of that vascular tissue system by features of the ground tissue. And we'll see that as we move through the plant body, as we move into roots and stems and leaves in the coming days. All right, let's peek at some ground tissue really, really quick. And I just want to remind us of our old friend celery here. So if we think about celery from the tissue perspective, the epidermis would just be a single cell layer all the way around. At this scale, I can't even see it. I have to magnify even further. So that's our ground tissue. Our vascular tissue is going to be these bundles that we see right here. But everything else in this field of view is going to be that ground tissue. So all of these cells over here, all of that is ground tissue. Even our bundles of parenchyma cells that we talked about earlier, those are going to be ground tissue as well. Well, our third and our final tissue type is going to be that vascular tissue. Vascular tissue, like our ground tissue, is going to be a complex tissue. And so it's going to have more than one cell type making it up. And it functions really in conduction, right? Moving water, nutrients, and sugars throughout the plant body. Also a little bit in storage and some support. Well, there's two parts to vascular tissue. They're kind of these two different pathways. The first part that I want to talk about is xylem. Now, xylem, I always want you to make red. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to make it easy for you to kind of understand these drawings and kind of compare them in similarities. Now, xylem is going to be the part of the vascular tissue system that moves water and minerals from the roots up. So it's going to move water and minerals that are going to be absorbed from the soil and move it up in the plant body. As far as the cells we can find in the xylem, the ones that are actually moving the water, we've already talked about. Those are those tracheary elements. They're going to move the water and whatever's dissolved in it, right, those minerals, up. There's also going to be some fibers in there for support. And we can also find parenchyma inside the xylem, serving really as some storage inside there. Right, so that's our xylem. Our other component to our vascular tissue system is phloem. And phloem, I always want you to have in blue in your drawings. Now, phloem is going to be responsible for moving sugars from the leaves or whatever's photosynthesizing to wherever they're needed. So it's going to be primarily involved in moving sugars throughout the plant body, but it's a little more dynamic than that. Xylem is really just moving water and minerals up, but phloem's kind of like the super highway inside the plant, in the sense that, hormones can be transported through there, to signal different parts of the plant. As far as the cells inside the phloem tissue that are accomplishing that function, well, we're going to have parenchyma cells that, just like in our xylem, can be used as some storage inside the phloem. We can find fiber cells for support, but the cells that are actually doing the work of the phloem tissue are what we call sieve tube elements. And so these are the conductive cells of the phloem. And one thing that's going to make phloem a little bit more dynamic than xylem, Remember, these tracheary elements inside the xylem are sclerenchyma cells, so they're going to be dead at functional maturity. While sieve tube elements are going to be kind of a weird type of parenchyma, so they're going to be living at functional maturity. That's going to make phloem a little bit more dynamic because it's not just these dead, empty tubes. They're kind of weird cells. You can kind of think of them as zombie cells. And what I mean by that is that they're always going to have these partner cells called companion cells. Because at maturity, they actually lack nuclei, which is really strange. Well, let's look at some of these. All right, so our vascular tissues here. Remember, it's going to have these two components, xylem and phloem. Xylem transporting water, phloem transporting sugars. Here we're looking at a close-up of a bundle of vascular tissue. Our vascular tissues are always going to be found together. And these really large diameter cells that we're seeing right here, that's our xylem tissue. You can see that red color from that secondary cell wall right here in the xylem. Those are those tracheary elements in cross-section. Well, here's our phloem cells right here. And right here in these cucurbita or squash stems. Here we're looking at our phloem a little bit more carefully, and we can see these sieve tube elements, these conductive cells. Here's one of those companion cells, those little controller cells. These kind of cool things that look like nets right here, those are just where the end walls of the sieve tube elements are. There's just little pores and holes in there that the sugar water's going to travel through. Here they are in longitudinal section, right? These are those sieve tube elements. They're largely forming tubes running through that phloem, but they're going to be alive at functional maturity, and we're not going to see those lignified secondary cell walls the way we would, say, if we were looking at those tracheary elements inside the xylem. All right, well, that's it for today. See you later.